The auction block in Silver Ridge had seen many shameful transactions, but the sale of Eleanor Heartfelt would become the story the town spent decades trying to forget. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street where a crowd had gathered outside the land office. Men shifted their weight from boot to boot, avoiding each other's eyes while their wives whispered behind gloved hands. At the center of it all stood Eleanor, 28 years old, dressed in a gray dress with sleeves that reached her wrists despite the August heat. Her dark hair was pulled back severe and plain, and her eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. "Now, gentlemen," called out Richard Heartfelt, her dead husband's brother, from his position on the raised platform. "I'm selling my brother's widow to settle his debts. Thomas owed nearly every man in this territory, and I aim to make things right. The woman comes as is, sight unseen." He paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "She refuses to undress for proper inspection, so bid accordingly." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Eleanor's hands trembled, but she kept them clasped tight at her waist. She'd learned long ago not to flinch, not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. "Do I hear $10? Richard's voice carried across the street. Silence. A crow cawed from the roof of the general store. Somewhere down the street, a horse stamped and blew through its nostrils. $8? She can cook, clean, mend. Good strong back for farm work. More silence. Eleanor felt the heat of their stares, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like the summer sun. She'd known this moment would come, known that Thomas's final cruelty would extend beyond his grave. He'd made certain of that. $5, then. Come now, that's less than the cost of a decent horse. A man in the back spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Won't even show herself proper. Could be diseased. Could be scarred up worse than a $2 mule. That's exactly why she won't show herself, someone else called out, and another wave of laughter broke over Eleanor like dirty water. She closed her eyes. Just endure. Just survive. It was all she'd ever done. I'll give you 15. The voice cut through the mockery like a knife through butter. Deep, quiet, and utterly certain. The crowd parted, and Eleanor opened her eyes to see a man stepping forward from the shade of the livery stable. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore simple working clothes and moved with the deliberate grace of someone who never wasted motion. $15, the man repeated, pulling worn bills from his pocket. Cash money, right now. Richard's eyes widened with greedy surprise. Sold to Mr. James Blackwood. A pleasure doing business with you, sir. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, ashamed now that someone had actually bought the widow, ashamed that they'd witnessed it at all. Eleanor stood frozen as James Blackwood climbed the platform and held out his hand to her. Not to take her arm, not to claim her like property, but simply offering his hand like a gentleman helping a lady down from a carriage. She stared at that outstretched hand for a long moment before placing her trembling fingers in his palm. His skin was calloused and warm, his grip steady but gentle. I have a wagon around back, he said simply. Unless you have belongings to collect. Eleanor shook her head. Everything she owned was already on her body. The grey dress, the worn boots, the long sleeves she could never, ever remove. They walked to his wagon in silence. He helped her up onto the seat with the same quiet courtesy, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses started forward with a creak of leather and wood, and Silver Ridge began to fall away behind them. For the first mile, neither spoke. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, preparing herself for what would come. She knew what men wanted. She knew what they thought they'd bought. My ranch is about 8 miles west, James finally said, his eyes on the road ahead. I run cattle, some horses. Keep a vegetable garden and chickens. The house is small but solid. You'll have your own room. Eleanor blinked, certain she'd misheard. My own room? Yes. He glanced at her briefly, then back to the horses. I bought you to give you a choice, not to take choices away. If you want to stay and work as housekeeper, you're welcome. If you want me to take you to the next town and set you up with traveling money, I'll do that too. Either way, no one will hurt you again. Something cracked in Eleanor's chest, some small fissure in the wall she'd built around her heart. She couldn't speak, couldn't even nod, so she simply sat there as tears slid silently down her cheeks. James said nothing, just kept the horses moving steady across the prairie. The ranch appeared as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. It was indeed small but well-maintained, with a neat house, a sturdy barn, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the golden light. Everything spoke of a man who took pride in his work, who built things to last. James helped Eleanor down from the wagon and led her inside. The house was simply furnished but clean, with curtains at the windows and books on a shelf by the fireplace. He showed her to a small bedroom with a real bed, a washstand, and a window looking out toward the mountains. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said from the doorway. "There's a pump out back if you want to wash up. Dinner will be ready in about an hour. Nothing fancy, just stew." Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself. "Mr. Blackwood, I should explain. About the dress. About why I wouldn't." "You don't owe me explanations," he interrupted gently. "Not Todd. Whatever you want to tell me, you tell me when you're ready. If that day never comes, that's fine too." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed and wept. The next 2 weeks passed in a careful dance of mutual respect and cautious distance. Eleanor rose early each morning to cook breakfast, clean the house, tend the garden, and prepare meals. She worked with fierce determination, as if proving her value through labor. James worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, speaking little but always polite, always careful never to startle her or corner her in a room. But the August heat was relentless, and Eleanor refused to remove her long sleeves. She wore them buttoned tight at the wrists while she hung laundry, while she weeded the garden, while she cooked over the hot stove. James noticed but said nothing, though she sometimes caught him watching her with concern in those storm-gray eyes. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, during the hottest part of the day. Eleanor was taking sheets down from the line when the world suddenly tilted sideways. She felt the ground rushing up to meet her, felt the sheets tangling around her like a burial shroud, and then nothing. When James found her 10 minutes later, she was unconscious in the dirt, her face flushed with dangerous color. He didn't hesitate. He carried her into the house, laid her on her bed, and began to loosen the tight collar of her dress. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse rapid and thready. Heatstroke. He'd seen it kill men before. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her unconscious form. "But I'm not letting you die." He unbuttoned the back of her dress with shaking fingers, peeling the heavy fabric away to let air reach her overheated skin. And then he saw what Eleanor had spent years hiding. Her entire back was a mass of scar tissue. Not random scars from accidents or work, but deliberate marks, carefully placed. Letters. Burned into her flesh with something hot, applied with precision and terrible patience. The scars formed words across her shoulder blades and down her spine. Eleanor. Property. Heartwell. And worse things, crueler words, branded into her skin like she was cattle. James stood frozen, staring at the evidence of sustained torture, of systematic cruelty beyond anything he'd imagined. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, he understood the full depth of what Eleanor had survived. He fetched cool water and cloths, carefully bathing her overheated skin, treating the scars with the same gentle respect he'd give any wound. He left her dress loosened but covered her with a light sheet, then sat in a chair by the door to wait. Eleanor woke as the sun was setting. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, and then awareness crashed over her. She could feel the air on her back, could feel the lightness where the heavy dress had been loosened. She sat up with a gasp, clutching the sheet to her chest, and found James sitting quietly by the door, his face in shadow. "Now you know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Now you know why no one wants me. Why I wouldn't undress. Why I'm not worth even $5. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I'm marked. Ruined. Thomas made sure everyone would know I belonged to him, even after he drank himself to death. I'm not a woman anymore. I'm just a thing that someone broke and threw away. James was silent for a long moment. Then he stood and moved to the window, his back to her. My first wife was beautiful, he said quietly. The most beautiful woman in 3 counties. Men wrote poems about her eyes. Women envied her grace. He paused. She beat me for 7 years. Eleanor's breath caught. James turned to face her, and in the dying light, she could see the truth in his eyes. Started with words, then dishes, then fists. Then anything she could reach when the rage took her. I was twice her size. But I'd been raised never to strike a woman. So I endured. I made excuses. I told myself it would get better. He began unbuttoning his own shirt. It never got better. He pulled the shirt off, and Eleanor saw the scars across his ribs, his chest, his arms. Long white lines from a knife. Round burn marks from cigars. A crooked place on his collarbone where it had healed wrong after being broken. She died 2 years ago. Fell from her horse during one of her rages. The whole territory mourned the loss of such a beautiful woman. James's voice was flat, emotionless. I stood at her grave and felt nothing but relief. He pulled his shirt back on. So when you tell me you're not worth wanting because someone hurt you, because someone marked you as property, I want you to understand something. I'll take scarred and kind any day over beautiful and cruel. I'll take a woman who survived over one who broke others. We match, Eleanor. We match in ways that matter. Eleanor stared at him, this quiet rancher who'd bought her for $15 and given her more respect than she'd known in years. The tears came then, real tears, not the silent seeping she'd perfected but deep, shaking sobs that bent her double. Years of holding everything in, years of enduring, years of believing she deserved the pain, all of it came pouring out. James didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her. He simply stood there, a steady presence, until the storm passed. When Eleanor finally looked up, her face wet and blotchy, he handed her a clean handkerchief. You're safe here, he said simply. For as long as you want to stay. No obligations. No expectations. Just safety. I want to stay, Eleanor whispered. I want to stop running. James nodded. Then you're home. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. Eleanor began wearing lighter dresses, though still with long sleeves when others were around. But in the privacy of the ranch, working in the garden with only James nearby, she sometimes rolled up her sleeves to her elbows. Small steps. Testing the possibility of freedom. They talked more, sharing stories of their lives in careful installments. James told her about growing up in Virginia, about coming west after the war, about building the ranch with his own hands. Eleanor spoke haltingly about her childhood, about marrying Thomas when she was 19 and hopeful, about the slow transformation from husband to monster. The first time he used the poker, I'd burned his dinner, she said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. He said I needed to remember my place. To remember who I belonged to. She touched her shoulder blade unconsciously. He added new words every time I displeased him. It became his favorite pastime when he was drunk. James's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. He was wrong. You don't belong to anyone but yourself. I'm trying to believe that, Eleanor said softly. Autumn came to the Montana territory, painting the mountains in gold and red. Eleanor had been at the ranch for 3 months, and the careful distance between her and James had gradually shortened. They worked side by side now, comfortable in shared silence or easy conversation. When James rode out to check the cattle, Eleanor felt his absence like a missing piece. She was beginning to understand that what she felt wasn't gratitude or obligation. It was something far more dangerous. Something that felt like hope. The trouble came on a cold October morning when 3 men rode up to the ranch. Eleanor was in the kitchen making bread when she heard the horses. Through the window, she saw Richard Hartwell dismount, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. Her blood turned to ice. She'd thought she was safe, thought she was far enough away that the past couldn't reach her. She'd been wrong. James emerged from the barn, his posture relaxed but alert. Eleanor could see them talking, could see Richard gesturing angrily, pointing toward the house. Toward her. She was standing frozen in the kitchen when the door opened and James stepped inside, alone. His face was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "Richard wants you back," he said simply. "Claims I bought stolen property. Says Thomas's debts weren't Richard's to settle by selling you, so the sale wasn't legal. He brought the sheriff from the next county to enforce it." Eleanor's hands went numb. "So I have to go back?" No, James's voice was absolutely certain. "I said no, you don't have to go anywhere. I asked you what you wanted. What I want doesn't matter. The law. The law can go to hell." James moved closer, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real anger in his eyes. Not directed at her, but burning fierce on her behalf. "Eleanor, I'm going to tell them to leave. If they don't, I'm going to make them leave. But I need to know you want me to fight this. I need to know you want to stay." Eleanor looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness, who'd proven that gentleness wasn't weakness and strength didn't require cruelty. She thought about going back to Silver Ridge, back to being whispered about and pitted and treated like damaged goods. She thought about leaving this place where she'd started to heal, started to become someone other than Thomas Hartwell's broken widow. "I want to stay," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to fight." James nodded once, something fierce and satisfied crossing his face. "Then stay inside. Lock the door. This won't take long." He walked back outside, and Eleanor moved to the window. She watched as James spoke to Richard and the sheriff, his body language making it clear the conversation was over. Richard's face turned red with anger. He grabbed for James's shoulder. What happened next took only seconds. James caught Richard's wrist, twisted, and had the man on his knees in the dirt before the sheriff could even react. When one of the other men reached for his gun, James had his own weapon out faster than Eleanor could track, aimed steady and sure. "Here's what's going to happen," James said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You're going to get on your horses and ride away. You're going to tell everyone in Silver Ridge that Eleanor Hartwell has a home here, and anyone who tries to take her from it will answer to me. And you, Richard, are going to spend the rest of your life being grateful I'm a civilized man, because if I was the kind of man you are, I'd kill you for what your brother did to her." He released Richard, who scrambled backward. The sheriff, a portly man who clearly had no desire for violence, held up both hands. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm just here to keep the peace. If the lady wants to stay, that's her right. Common law marriage has its claims too, after all. Richard, let's go." They left, riding hard back towards Silver Ridge. Eleanor unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch as James holstered his gun. He turned to look at her, and she saw her own fierce satisfaction reflected in his face. "Thank you," she said simply. "You don't need to thank me for doing what's right." He climbed the porch steps, stopping one below the top so they were eye to eye. "Eleanor, I need to say something, and you don't have to respond. You don't owe me anything. But I need you to know." He took a breath. "These past 3 months have been the happiest of my life. Coming home to find you in my kitchen. Talking with you on the porch. Knowing you're safe. I don't want you to stay because you're grateful or because you owe me. I want you to stay because you want to. Because maybe, someday, you might feel even a fraction of what I feel for you." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "And what do you feel?" "I love you," James said simply. "I love your strength. I love your kindness. I love the way you hum when you make bread and the way you talk to the chickens. I love every scar you carry because they're proof you survived. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to be your husband. Real husband, not like before. Partners. Equals. But if you're not ready, if you never want that, I'll still count myself blessed to have you in my life however you'll allow." Eleanor reached out and took his hand, threading her scarred fingers through his. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't know I could feel this way again. Didn't know I was capable of it. But I do. I love you, James Blackwood." He smiled then, a real smile that lit up his whole face. "Then marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't have to hurt." "Yes," Eleanor said, and kissed him for the first time, standing on the porch of the home they would share. They married 2 weeks later, in the small church in the next town over, with the minister and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore a new dress, pale blue with long sleeves she'd chosen herself. James wore his Sunday suit and couldn't stop smiling. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with such gentle reverence that Eleanor felt something break free inside her chest, some last chain snapping loose. The first year of their marriage was a season of healing and discovery. Eleanor slowly learned that intimacy could be tender, that a man's touch could be gentle, that love could build up instead of tear down. James was endlessly patient, letting her set the pace, proving with every word and action that she was cherished, not owned. She began to wear short sleeves in summer, her scars visible to anyone who looked. Some people stared. Some whispered. Eleanor learned not to care. She belonged to herself now, and these marks were just proof she'd survived. They held no power over her anymore. When their daughter was born the following spring, Eleanor named her Hope. It seemed fitting. The town of Silver Ridge eventually forgot its shame, or buried it deep the way towns do. Richard Hartwell moved away after too many men refused to do business with someone who'd tried to sell his brother's widow like cattle. The story became local legend, the kind of tale told in hushed voices about the rancher who'd bought a woman at auction and given her freedom instead of chains. On their 5th anniversary, James found Eleanor in the garden, their daughter playing in the dirt nearby, their son napping in his cradle under the shade of the porch. He wrapped his arms around his wife from behind and kissed the top of her head. "Happy?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, watching Hope chase a butterfly through the bean plants. She thought about the woman who'd stood on that auction block, certain she was worth less than nothing, certain she'd never know peace again. She thought about how wrong she'd been. "So happy I could burst with it," she said. "Every single day." James tightened his embrace. "Good. That's all I ever wanted." And there, on a small ranch in Montana Territory, in the arms of a gentle man who'd taught her that love could heal, Eleanor Blackwood finally came home.